tinsel is bright, but the air inside is freezing. This year, the familiar scent of pine and gingerbread is suffocated by the heavy weight of unspoken history. We are gathered here, a collection of strangers tethered only by shared blood, forcing a holiday truce that feels more like an intervention than a reunion. The traditions meant to comfort us now only serve as a harsh backdrop, exposing the vast, painful distance we've traveled apart. Every strained laugh and careful conversation is a crack widening in the foundation. We cling to the hope that forgiveness is possible, even as the ghost of a past betrayal waits patiently for the inevitable moment to finally break through. But before we continue, don't forget to subscribe and like our channel. What city are you listening to this story from? Write to us in the comments. Now let's continue. The cold hit me first, sharper than usual, as I stepped onto the veranda of Blackwood Manor. This sprawling Victorian house, isolated deep in upstate New York, was coated in a fresh layer of silent, judgmental snow. Every December, I drive up here, not for joy, but for the performance. This year, the stage felt set for a tragedy. I was here attempting to hold together threads that were already dust. I am Ethan Alexander Miller, 35, and I am the cautious peacemaker, the one who always tries to find the median line between two warring factions, a self-assigned role that has left me perpetually weary. My deep-set eyes probably showed the strain of decades spent translating my father's stoicism for my siblings' resentment. I yearned for genuine connection, but I knew I was walking into an intervention dressed up in tinsel. The air inside Blackwood Manor was thick, a noxious blend of expensive pine boughs, overly sweet gingerbread, and the deep, persistent smell of moldering history. My father, Arthur Hayes Miller, 65, was waiting in the great hall. Tall, silver-haired, his imposing posture never faltered, even as the tension in the air thickened enough to cut. He views family issues not as emotional matters but as logistics to be controlled, managed, and ultimately, stifled. His classic, stoic greeting, a single, sharp nod, felt less like a paternal welcome and more like a military inspection. Beside him, my mother, Eleanor Rose Miller, 63, offered a brittle, forced smile. Her soft features were strained, the lines around her eyes deeper than I remembered. Her hands, perpetually clutched together like she was holding back a flood, spoke volumes about the secret burden she carried. She was the family's superficial nurture, the one who attempted to infuse the room with warmth, but her fragility was visible, a hairline fracture running through the marble foundation of the household. Ethan, Arthur's voice was low, resonating off the wood paneling. You're late. Dinner is scheduled for 7 sharp. Liam and Clara are already upstairs. The roads were slow, Dad, I replied, stripping off my heavy coat, depositing the weight of the upstate winter onto a mahogany bench. The formality was exhausting. We weren't a family, we were participants in a mandatory, emotionally devastating corporate retreat. The atmosphere intensified when we moved into the oak dining hall. This room, large and opulent, was usually reserved only for major holidays, ensuring that every gathering felt suffocatingly important. The massive mahogany table, polished to a sickening sheen, reflected the faces gathered around it, a stage for repressed conflict. Overhead, crystal chandeliers cast sharp, unforgiving light on everything, particularly on the Miller family portrait hanging above the mantel. That painting, framed in heavy gold, showed us from perhaps 15 years ago, a false vision of unity, smiling unnaturally bright, serving now only as a painful, damning contrast to the fragmented people we had become. We sat down, the heavy silence punctuated only by the clinking of silver and Eleanor's desperate, high-pitched attempts at making small talk about the weather and the difficulty of finding authentic Danish butter cookies this year. Then, there was the arrival of the others. My sister, Clara Maeve Miller, 38, arrived late, sweeping into the hall as if daring the atmosphere to break her. She possessed sharp features, and the visible tension in her jawline suggested she was constantly grinding her teeth against some inner grievance. Guarded, intensely resentful, Clara carried the visible scars of the 2014 disagreement with Arthur, the one that had broken her trust and severed her original path in life. She didn't look at Arthur, she looked through him, making every forced pleasantry feel like a knife's edge. And finally, Liam Maxwell Miller, 32. My youngest brother entered last, his wiry frame perpetually slouched, a physical representation of the chip on his shoulder. Volatile, consumed by bitterness, he masked a desperate need for validation with sharp, cynical jabs directed at the institution of Blackwood Manor itself. He sat down, not pulling out his chair, but shoving it back with a violent scraping noise that made Arthur flinch almost imperceptibly. The strained Christmas Eve dinner began. We passed dishes, turkey, cranberries, dressing, as if they were weighted metaphors for our resentments, handling them carefully, lest they spill and stain the impeccable linen. "I heard your firm landed the Hastings account, Ethan," Arthur said, attempting to steer the conversation toward professional success, the only topic he seemed to deem safe. "It's a good start to the new year," I confirmed, aware that good start meant satisfactory to Arthur's expectations. Liam snorted, a low, guttural sound. "Ah, corporate conquest. Perfect theme for Christmas. I'm sure the Hastings account will keep you warm when the family calls fall through again." "Liam," Eleanor cautioned weakly, her hand fluttering near her chest. "What?" "It's true," Liam shrugged, stabbing a piece of turkey. "I just find it fascinating, Dad, how you value measurable profit over, things that are actual worth, like creativity, or honesty." Arthur placed his fork down with military precision. Clink. "Honesty, Liam, is often a luxury afforded by stability. A stability that certain people here seem determined to undermine at every turn." This was where Clara, who had remained silent, entered the fray. Her voice was low, laced with the acid of years of stored pain. "Stability purchased at whose expense, Arthur?" "We're all familiar with the price tags." The air crystallized. That was the core of the 2014 rupture, the event that had forced Clara to abandon her application to a prestigious art school overseas, though the full details of why she abandoned it were always murky, obscured by Arthur's tight-lipped control. "That is a tired topic, Clara," Arthur stated, his voice flat, but the muscle in his jaw ticking rapidly. "We made the decision that was best for the family structure at the time." "No," Clara said, pushing her plate away. "You made the decision that was best for your image of the family structure." The dinner dissolved rapidly from there, scattering into strained pleasantries, everyone avoiding the central fissure. I tried to bridge the gap, asking Liam about his job writing freelance reviews, attempting to validate his creative pursuits, but Liam was already too far gone, focused on the perceived slight. Later, the scene shifted to the vast, formal drawing room. The gigantic Christmas tree stood proud and overdecorated, its twinkling lights serving as a stark, unbearable backdrop exposing our fragile foundation. We were supposed to be exchanging small gifts, but the presents felt like tokens, hollow offerings meant to substitute for actual emotional connection. The mid-celebration eruption didn't wait for the carols to finish. It happened as Eleanor tried, awkwardly, to hand Arthur a gift. "It's just a small something, dear," she murmured, her voice trembling. "Thank you, Eleanor," Arthur responded, accepting it without looking her in the eye, his focus still on monitoring the passive-aggressive movements of his children. Liam, standing near the mantel, picked up a heavy porcelain figurine of a cheerful Santa, turning it over in his hand. These things always remind me of the fundamental dishonesty of this house. Everything looks perfect, expensive, and festive. But if you tap it," he demonstrated by tapping the base sharply, "it's utterly hollow inside." Arthur's control finally snapped. "Put that down, Liam. Immediately. If you have a grievance, articulate it like an adult, or leave the premises." "I can articulate it," Liam shot back, slamming the figurine onto the mantel. "It's about the fact that nothing here is real. We're here because we're supposed to be, not because we want to be. We're still playing roles assigned to us decades ago. Ethan, the dutiful successor, Mom, the silent martyr, Clara, the failed artist, and me, the perpetual disappointment." Clara's fury wasn't aimed at Liam's cruelty, but at his proximity to the truth. "Stop acting like you have the monopoly on disappointment, Liam. At least you were allowed to fail publicly. At least your choices weren't stolen from you." "What does that even mean, Clara?" Liam demanded. Clara's face was white with rage, years of bottled resentment finally boiling over. "It means that your petty cynicism doesn't compare to having your entire future rewritten, not by choice, but by manipulation. It means sacrificing everything because Dad couldn't handle a single thread of imperfection in his perfect tapestry." Arthur exploded, the sound echoing in the high ceilings. "That is enough. You will not use this holiday to dredge up old, settled arguments. You are guests in my home, and I demand basic civility." Arthur, defeated for the first time in my memory, abruptly turned and walked out of the room, disappearing toward the back study. I saw his hand slip into his vest pocket, gripping Arthur's watch, the antique pocket watch passed down through generations, his ultimate symbol of tradition and the crushing weight of responsibility he claimed to bear. The silence that followed was heavy, charged with the acrid scent of scorched earth. Eleanor stood in the middle of the room, her shoulders shaking silently, looking utterly broken. Liam immediately regretted his outburst, sinking onto a sofa, his hands covering his face. Clara, however, remained standing, her chest heaving, her eyes fixed on the door Arthur had exited through. I realized this wasn't just a squabble. This was the moment of inevitable breakage. We had come back not for cheer, but for this very confrontation with the ghosts of our past. "Clara, what exactly happened in 2014? I asked, finally shedding my role as neutral third party. It was always hushed up. Was it financial? Did something happen to the grant? Clara laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. You really don't know, do you? You always accepted the official narrative, Ethan. The official narrative was that I chose to stay, that I realized my place was here. She looked down at Eleanor, whose quiet weeping had become a desperate plea. Eleanor shook her head frantically, a silent communication passing between mother and daughter, a signal to stop. Mom knows, Clara whispered, her voice cracking. She's always known. Eleanor bolted, running through the drawing room and out the main doors, seeking escape from the spotlight. This couldn't wait until morning. I knew instinctively that whatever Arthur was guarding, whatever Eleanor was suppressing, was in that study. The sheer force of the tension had now fractured the foundation, and the truth, whatever its form, was now demanded by the light. I found Arthur in his study, a dark, wood-paneled room that smelled strongly of leather and old books. He was standing by his desk, his back to me, the pocket watch chain dangling loosely from his hand. You should go back downstairs, Ethan, Arthur said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, the ultimate sign of his defensive closure. The evening is ruined, but there is no need for further theater. The theater is over, Dad, I countered, stepping fully into the room. We're past civility. We are a family that has been rotting from the inside for 10 years because you insist on secrecy over truth. Clara is right. What did you steal from her? Arthur spun around, his silver hair catching the dim light. His eyes, usually cold and calculating, held a flicker of genuine terror. You don't understand the complexities of reputation. The importance of maintaining integrity. Integrity? We're miserable. I pressed. My gaze fell upon the only item out of place on his meticulously neat desk, the locked cedar box. It was small, polished, and clearly very old. Arthur's hand instinctively reached for it, hovering protectively. What's in the box, Dad? Before Arthur could fabricate a lie, the door to the study opened again. It wasn't Eleanor, but Clara and Liam, drawn by the psychic magnet of the unfolding crisis. They stood shoulder to shoulder, united for the first time in years, against him. Don't touch that, Arthur, Clara warned, her voice steady now, terrifyingly calm. If you put your hand on that box, I will walk out of this house and never return. Arthur hesitated, his emotional control completely dismantled. The silence stretched, unbearable, until a soft cough broke it. Eleanor stood in the doorway, her face pale, but a new, steel resolve hardening her features. Arthur, stop, Eleanor whispered. She walked past Liam and Clara, moving slowly toward the desk. Her eyes met mine, and I saw a lifetime of regret distilled into a single, painful look. He won't do it, Ethan. He can't. But I can. She reached out, her trembling fingers settling on the lid of the locked cedar box. Arthur let out a guttural sound, a noise of pure, primal defeat, as she opened it. The box contained two things, a sheaf of yellowed correspondence and a legal document. Eleanor carefully lifted the letters. The secret, Eleanor began, her voice gaining strength, it isn't just about Clara's schooling in 2014. That was the cover story. The real secret is why Arthur had to create that cover story. She held up the legal document, clearly a settlement release. In 2014, your Uncle Robert, Arthur's brother, didn't simply move away and cut off contact, as we told everyone. He died. And he didn't die naturally. He died in a car accident caused by Arthur. The air rushed out of my lungs. I looked at Arthur, who was now leaning heavily on the desk, unable to meet our eyes. It was a terrible situation, Eleanor continued, tears streaming down her face, no longer silently contained. Arthur was driving after a charity gala. He was over the limit, barely. But Robert? Robert was killed instantly. Liam let out a choked gasp, shaking his head in disbelief. Arthur paid off the authorities, used every connection he had to bury the entire incident as a single car crash, driver error by Robert, Eleanor explained. He saved his career, he saved his reputation, but the settlement required a massive, immediate payment. That payment came directly out of the trust fund that Clara needed to access for her art school tuition and living expenses abroad. Clara hadn't chosen to stay. Her path hadn't been stolen by parental disapproval, it had been sacrificed to bury a manslaughter charge. The gravity of the lie, a decade of silence, of forcing Clara to live a diminished life built on a lie, all to protect Arthur's imposing reputation, was seismic. You let me blame myself, Clara managed, her voice dangerously low. For 10 years, you let me believe that my dream wasn't important enough to fight for. You told me that I needed to be responsible, when you were covering up a death. Robert was my favorite uncle. You let me mourn him under a pretense of shame and distance. Arthur finally looked up, his face etched with pure anguish. I did it to protect us. To protect the structure. If that truth came out, we would have lost everything, the house, the businesses, the stability you all rely on. We didn't rely on it, Dad, I said, feeling the bitterness rise in my own throat, sharper than any I had ever felt before. We relied on you. And you built a wall of lies, cementing it with our relationships. This was the raw and necessary confrontation. The walls came down entirely. Liam, fueled by a renewed sense of betrayal, lunged toward Arthur, stopped only by my quick interception. You're not just emotionally repressed, Arthur, Liam spat, struggling against me. You're fundamentally corrupt. You took away Clara's life, and you took away the truth about the only decent relative we had left. Eleanor, freed from the silence, suddenly collapsed onto the rug, sobbing uncontrollably. The sheer volume of truth was too much for the old house to contain. The twinkling lights of the Christmas tree seemed to mock the darkness we had uncovered. I let go of Liam, who immediately dropped to his knees beside Eleanor, holding his mother as she wept out a decade of fear. I was wrong, Arthur finally said, the words barely audible, stripped of all pride and control. He was no longer the imposing patriarch, he was a fragile old man facing the consequences of his fear. I thought I was protecting us. I thought the lie would eventually fade into history. I was afraid, terrified of losing respect, of being judged. I let fear define me, and I let it destroy my children's happiness. Clara didn't move toward him. She simply stood, absorbing the damage, the betrayal too fresh and monumental to forgive in a single moment. I don't know how to come back from this, Arthur, she said, her voice hollow. I don't know who you are, and I don't know who I am supposed to be now, knowing that the foundation of my adult life was based on your criminal cover-up. The night descended into a miserable, fragmented aftermath. The Christmas Eve gifts lay forgotten under the tree. The dinner was cold in the dining hall. The revelation had not brought immediate relief, only a blinding, overwhelming pain. We had torn down the walls, but now we were standing in the wreckage, unsure how to begin rebuilding. As later, the house had grown silent. Arthur had retreated to his room, defeated. Eleanor was sleeping, medicated, utterly spent. Liam remained in the drawing room, staring blankly at the dying fire. I knew I needed to talk to Clara. She was the epicenter of this wound, the one whose life had been most profoundly redirected. I found her outside, bundled in a thick shawl, standing on the edge of the sunken garden. The garden was neglected, covered in a thin, hard frost, symbolizing the abandonment of our family relationships. I walked up beside her, not speaking, just letting the cold air and the sound of the distant wind fill the void. I came out here every year, Ethan, Clara finally murmured, her breath clouding in the moonlight. I used to come here when I was a kid and imagine what I would paint if I ever got to go to Florence. I'd imagine the light in Italy. When the application fell through, I kept coming out here, thinking I needed to get over the failure, the rejection. She turned to me, her eyes glistening. I wasn't rejected, Ethan. I was erased. I'm sorry, Clara, I said, the words feeling pitifully inadequate against 10 years of lost dreams. I should have pressed harder. I trusted the silence. We all did, she conceded, leaning her head against my shoulder. The contact, small and tentative, felt monumental after the night's trauma. It's easier to accept the comfortable lie than the devastating truth. We stood there for a long time, sharing the silence, no longer avoiding the pain, but embracing the messiness of it. This was not the magical smoothing over the carols promised. This was a painful, necessary fight, demanding that we see each other not as the villains of past mistakes, but as imperfect people yearning for connection. What do we do now? I asked her quietly. Clara sighed, wrapping her arms around herself. We try to redefine what family means, outside of his structure. We stop being Arthur's children, and start being people who choose to see each other. The first step was forgiveness, but not for Arthur, not yet. The first step was forgiving ourselves for holding on to the hurt, for prioritizing the perceived stability over the raw, terrifying truth. I looked at the house, Blackwood Manor, massive and dark against the winter sky. It wasn't home yet. It was still the tomb of a decade of lies. But perhaps, if we chose understanding over holding on to old hurt, if we embraced the imperfections of the ones we loved, a volatile brother, a broken mother, and even my own cautious peacekeeping, maybe, just maybe, we could start the difficult, slow journey of finding our way back. Clara shifted away from me and looked up at the moon. I won't forgive him tonight, she stated clearly. But I can start forgiving myself for believing the lie. And I can forgive you, for not knowing. We survived this. It was the quiet moment of redemption, not loud or transformative in a fairy tale sense, but quiet, profound, and utterly real. This Christmas had been a wrecking ball, but sometimes, you have to tear down the walls completely to see the blueprint for what you truly need. We had a long way to go. Marked by tears and the sudden, raw honesty that had cracked open the Miller family, but for the first time in years, the thread connecting me and my sister felt strong, durable, and genuine. We weren't a lost family anymore. We were simply finding our footing on the ruins, beginning the arduous process of rebuilding, together. The true, transformative magic of Christmas was not about cheer, but about the painful, redemptive power of truth. The sunken garden, cloaked in frost and shadowed moonlight, offered a terrible kind of peace. I could feel the cold seeping through my shoes, but it was a minor discomfort compared to the decade of emotional freezing we had endured. Clara's head had rested on my shoulder only briefly, yet that connection had felt like the first honest, structural support Blackwood Manor had offered in years. It's not enough to be sorry, is it? I finally said, pulling my hands deeper into my pockets. Sorry doesn't bring back Florence. Sorry doesn't give you 10 years of having a different life, a different identity. Clara stepped back, her gaze fixed on the dense, skeletal branches of the neglected winter plants. No. Sorry is just the beginning of the paperwork. The real apology is going to be in how we handle this truth from now on. Not how he says it, but how we live it. She was right. Arthur's shame was overwhelming, but his shame was merely the consequence, our collective healing was the work. We had to stop being reactionaries to his control and start being protagonists in our own recovery. What about Liam? I asked. He barely knew Robert, but he was furious. It's not just the cover-up, it's the lack of connection. Liam hates being the disappointment because he suspects the entire framework of success is measured against is corrupt, Clara murmured. Robert was the one person who always told Liam his cynicism was just undeveloped passion. Arthur stripped us of any connection that threatened his narrative. We stood there until the cold became unbearable, a physical pain demanding we seek the meager warmth inside. When we returned to the drawing room, Liam was still on the floor, leaning against the cold hearth, and Eleanor was gone. The festive lights, now ignored, continued their relentless twinkling, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the charged air. Liam, I knelt beside him. We need to figure out what happens next. Not tonight, but when the sun comes up. We can't just let this go back into the dark. Liam lifted his head, his eyes bloodshot. He killed Robert. My uncle. And he made Mom live with that lie for 10 years. How do you sit across from that man at breakfast? We sit across from him because we need to understand the anatomy of the lie, I insisted gently. We need to know exactly what fear drove him, not so we can forgive him, but so we can stop repeating the pattern. Liam nodded slowly, a raw, painful understanding dawning in his eyes. He wasn't consumed by rage anymore, but by a chilling realization of reality. He built a fortress of stability on a graveyard. The foundation is rotting. I spent the rest of Christmas Eve wandering the halls of Blackwood Manor. It was a museum of our grief. I passed the Miller family portrait, and for the first time, I didn't see a lie, I saw a group of people already isolated, even when standing side by side. The smiles were forced because the connection was mandated, not chosen. I walked into the oak dining hall. The table was still set, the linens crumpled, the remnants of the strained Christmas Eve dinner a perfect still life of decay. I cleared the dishes, not out of duty, but because I needed a physical task to process the psychological load. As I scrubbed the grease from the plates, I thought about the sheer, exhausting weight Eleanor must have carried. Her fragility was no longer a personal weakness, it was the consequence of protecting Arthur's monstrous secret. When Christmas Day finally dawned, it did so with a brutal, white light. The air was heavy with unspoken words. We moved through the house like ghosts. Eleanor emerged from her room, looking frail, but resolute. Her eyes, usually clouded with anxiety, now held a sharp clarity, the clarity of a person who has faced their worst fear and survived. Arthur, however, remained sequestered. We didn't convene in the drawing room. We didn't exchange gifts. The ornaments on the towering tree seemed to mock the profound emptiness in the room. Around noon, Eleanor called us all together. She chose the library, a smaller, less formal room than the dining hall, but still steeped in Arthur's authority. Arthur was already there, standing before the large, mahogany desk, his posture finally broken. He was leaning, not standing, and Arthur never leaned. Arthur's watch was not in his hand, the chain lay coiled on the desk, abandoned. Eleanor placed the locked cedar box in the center of the desk. This is not going to be a casual conversation, Eleanor began, her voice steady, surprising us all. This is going to be a confrontation. But it is one that must happen if we are to move forward without being destroyed by what has already happened. Arthur raised his head, looking directly at Clara for the first time since the night before. Clara, I owe you everything. I stole your life. I allowed my vanity and my fear of public scrutiny to become more important than your future. I will spend the rest of my life trying to earn back a fraction of what I took. It was the most honest, raw confession I had ever heard from him, devoid of the usual corporate jargon or legalistic deflection. But honesty wasn't currency for 10 years of loss. Clara remained rigid, her sharp features set in stone. You didn't steal an opportunity, Arthur. You stole my self-worth. You convinced me I was mediocre, that I lacked the discipline or the talent to make it work, so I was forced to settle for a life I didn't want. That's the deepest betrayal. I apologize to Robert's memory, Arthur continued, his voice cracking. I apologize to you, Liam. Robert deserved the truth, and you deserve to mourn him properly. I allowed my own cowardice to dishonor a man who was better than me in every way. Liam shifted, unable to look at Arthur. It's not just Robert, Dad. It's how you operate. You view everything as a transaction. Our love, our loyalty, our paths, it was all a transaction to maintain the image of the Miller family stability. I hate that I need your validation so badly, and yet I know everything I've ever done has been filtered through the lens of what you would think of it. This was the core of the raw and necessary confrontation. It wasn't about the events of 2014 anymore, it was about the toxic structure that event exposed. I stepped forward, leaning my hands on the desk, meeting Arthur's defeated gaze. You kept emphasizing stability, Dad. but stability isn't just financial. It's emotional. You sacrifice the stability of our relationships for the stability of your bank account and reputation. And look at us. We are financially stable, housed in this beautiful prison, but we are completely lost. You are the reason we became a lost family. Arthur bowed his head, accepting the indictment. I always believed that the role of the patriarch was to protect the structure, no matter the cost. I failed to realize that the structure was meaningless if the people inside it were dying. Eleanor picked up the sheaf of yellowed correspondence from the cedar box. These are the letters Robert wrote to me in the months before he died. He knew Arthur was struggling with the business. He was coming to help. Arthur drove that night, full of pride and liquor, arguing with Robert over some trivial business risk. Robert was trying to save Arthur from himself, and Arthur killed him. The details were crushing. It wasn't a freak accident, it was a consequence of Arthur's emotional control and professional arrogance. The legal documents, Eleanor continued, holding up the settlement release. They explicitly state that the funds had to come from an accessible, individual trust, not corporate funds, to guarantee immediate secrecy and speed. Clara's trust was the only one available without public filing. Arthur signed away her future to save his own. Clara gasped, a sharp, ragged sound. She walked over to the desk and snatched the document from Eleanor's hand, reading the legalese that confirmed her fate. This name, Clara pointed to a signature block I recognized immediately, Arthur's longtime corporate attorney. He knew. He helped you bury this. He was at my high school graduation, Dad, shaking my hand and telling me how proud he was of my irresponsible decision to stay close to home. The sheer scope of the conspiracy was staggering. The lie extended beyond the immediate family, weaving itself into our entire social and professional network. Arthur had surrounded himself with people who prioritized his narrative. I had to ensure silence, Arthur whispered, his voice catching. Silence doesn't equal safety, Arthur, I refuted, my voice tight with my own latent fury. I realized my own cautious peacekeeping had merely been compliance with Arthur's silence. I had prioritized comfort over truth. We need to burn this down. All of it. Clara ripped the settlement document in half, the sound echoing through the quiet library. It wasn't a legal repudiation, but a symbolic act of taking back control of her narrative. I won't accept your apology as forgiveness, Clara told Arthur, her voice shaking with controlled emotion. I accept it as a confirmation that I was right to resent you. Now, we start from zero. And I will choose what I rebuild. Liam, finally moving, walked to the fireplace. He picked up a poker and began systematically smashing the porcelain Santa figurine that had triggered the initial eruption last night. The hollow shattering sound was visceral, a satisfying release of cynicism. It's hollow, Liam repeated, the fragments scattering on the hearth. We are not going to be hollow anymore. We're messy, we're angry, and we're damaged. But we're not hollow. Eleanor approached Arthur, not with a hug, but with a weary hand placed on his arm. Arthur, you need to confess to the only people who matter now, your children. Not for them to absolve you, but for you to live with the truth. This was the necessary shift. The confrontation had turned into a mandatory session of truth-telling, stripping away the roles we'd been forced to play. Arthur was no longer the imposing patriarch, he was a penitent. Eleanor was no longer the silent martyr, she was a survivor. Liam wasn't the cynical disappointment, he was the passionate realist. And Clara, the failed artist, was now the architect of her own redemption. Ethan, the cautious peacemaker, realized my role was to solidify the boundaries of the new normal. The house, the tradition, the name, it's all secondary now, I declared, looking at my siblings. The only tradition we carry forward is radical honesty. No more secrets, no matter how inconvenient or reputation damaging. We redefine stability not as control, but as mutual, vulnerable support. We needed a tangible, shared goal to mark this transformation. The cedar box, I pointed. It contained the lie. Let's burn the rest of the paperwork. Robert's letters belong with Mom, but everything related to the cover-up needs to be physically destroyed, now. In the fire. Arthur looked shocked, still clinging to the paper trail of his control. Those are legal records, Ethan. We may need them. We need to stop needing them, Clara countered fiercely. We need to stop living under the threat of exposure. Let the legal world worry about itself. Our family's records are now the story of this confrontation, not those papers. Liam grabbed the legal documents that Eleanor had yet to destroy and tossed them into the roaring fireplace. The dry paper caught quickly, curling into black ash. The act was sudden, violent, and utterly cleansing. Arthur watched the flames consume the evidence of his decade of fear. He made no move to stop them. When the fire died down, he looked truly empty, yet somehow, lighter. The afternoon passed in fits and starts, marred by painful, circular conversations where we dug into the specific moments of the past 10 years, the missed birthdays, the strained phone calls, the unspoken contempt, understanding now that every small break was a symptom of the central, gaping wound. We talked about Robert. Liam revealed that before Robert died, he had promised to help Liam secure an internship far away from Blackwood Manor, a hope Liam had buried when he was told Robert simply moved on. This was the validation Liam had always sought, proof that someone outside Arthur's rigid structures saw his worth. Clara, tears falling freely, spoke of the loneliness of trying to force herself into a career she hated, knowing deep down she was sacrificing her soul to what she thought was family necessity. She hadn't been fighting Arthur's disapproval, she had been fighting the consequences of his crime. Eleanor, relieved of the burden, was finally able to grieve her brother-in-law and the loss of her marriage. Her love for Arthur was still there, but it was now laced with a realistic, necessary bitterness. I need distance, Clara announced late that afternoon. I need to leave Blackwood Manor for a while, not because I hate this house, but because I need to rebuild my life where his shame can't touch it. I still have enough saved. I'm going to go to Europe. Not to Florence immediately, maybe, but to paint. To see if the talent is still there. This was her first truly free decision in 10 years. It was terrifying and magnificent. And I'm coming with you, Liam declared immediately. Not to hold your hand, but I need to see what the world looks like without this oppressive shadow. I need to write something real, not just reviews for corporate junk. Arthur watched them, his eyes wide, realizing his control was not just broken, but entirely dismantled. His children were choosing to flee his creation to save themselves. I knew my path was different. Blackwood Manor was my past, but the financial structure I had helped maintain was now the tool for their freedom. I will manage the funds, I told them, resting my hand on Arthur's shoulder, a gesture of management, not intimacy. I will make sure your trusts are completely separated from his business operations. I will be your anchor here, not as his successor, but as your ally. We didn't hug. We didn't exchange traditional Christmas farewells. The evening of Christmas Day was spent in a state of suspended animation, exhausted by the emotional excavation. Arthur, silent, finally picked up his pocket watch, Arthur's watch, but he didn't grip it with his usual anxiety. He merely held it, looking at the tarnished silver. It was just a timepiece now, not a symbol of oppressive tradition. The true transformative magic of Christmas didn't involve sudden warmth or forgiveness. It was the messy, agonizing process of choice. We chose honesty. We chose separation for the sake of reconnection. The quiet moment of redemption finally arrived, long after the stars came out, wrapping the isolated house in a blanket of silent snow. I found Clara back in the sunken garden. She wasn't shivering this time, she was looking up at the cold, vast sky, breathing deeply. It's still beautiful here, even covered in frost, she observed. It is, I agreed. The house didn't create the darkness, Clara. The people inside did. We came here looking for a traditional Christmas miracle, she said, turning toward me. But the miracle wasn't the healing, it was the bravery to cut out the infection. It was painful, necessary, and absolutely real. She smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile that reached her eyes, the first I had seen in years. It was the smile of someone who had survived a battle she didn't know she was fighting. Thank you, Ethan. For pushing the truth, even when I didn't want to hear it, and for being the thread that actually held. I reached out and hugged her, a long, firm embrace that finally acknowledged the decade of shared, silent pain. There was no need for words. We had faced the monster, and though we were scarred, we were standing. Go to Europe, Clara. Find the light, I told her. I will. And you, fix this fortress, Ethan. Make it a safe place to land, for all of us, when we decide to come back, not out of duty, but out of choice. We were no longer a lost family. We were a family in transit. We had torn down the walls and stood in the wreckage, accepting that the journey toward forgiveness would be long and marked by stumbles. But we had the blueprint now: honesty, messy connection, and the fierce commitment to seeing each other as imperfect people yearning for genuine love. The holiday had done its work, not by smoothing over the jagged edges, but by exposing them so we could start the hard, slow work of reshaping. Blackwood Manor would survive, changed utterly, no longer a monument to secrecy, but a place where the truth had finally been allowed to breathe. We had found our way back, not to the warmth of a perfect family, but to the challenging, redemptive truth of a real one. The quiet joy of that discovery, purchased at the cost of profound agony, was the only Christmas magic we truly needed. We were ready to start building home, one imperfect, honest day at a time, across the miles that would now separate us, but bind us with newfound, unbreakable trust. The snow fell silently, a heavy, muffling blanket that seemed to absorb the decade of noise we had created. Standing in the sunken garden with Clara, the cold no longer felt like a barrier but a clarifying agent. We had defined the terms of our survival, a separation for the sake of true connection. When we finally stepped back inside Blackwood Manor, the air felt thin, newly oxygenated after the fire and the storm of truth. Christmas Day, traditionally a day of forced proximity and consumption, was turning into a day of deconstruction. Liam was in the library, pacing the exact route Arthur used to take when he was negotiating a deal. He was folding the settlement documents' ashes, collecting them in a small, tarnished silver bowl, a macabre relic. "I'm going to bury these," Liam said, without looking up. "Somewhere far from here. Not as a memorial, but as an eviction notice. This lie doesn't get to pollute the ground anymore." Clara watched him, a slow, maternal realization softening the sharp edges of her face. "You're looking for a burial, not an escape, aren't you?" "Both," Liam admitted, pausing his pacing. "Europe isn't just a physical distance, it's a necessary cultural shift. Away from the pressure of performance, away from the ghost of what Robert represented to Arthur. I need to know if the words I write are mine, or if they're just arguments against the man who raised me." Understood. We had all measured our lives against Arthur's expectations, and now that the measuring stick was proven corrupt, we needed to find our own calibration. Clara moved toward the large, mahogany desk, Arthur's former command center. She opened the center drawer, which had always been locked, and found it empty save for a single key. "He didn't even bother to lock it again," Clara observed, turning the key over in her palm. "Has truly given up the illusion of control." "He has nothing left to control," I pointed out. "Just the consequences." The decision to leave, to define their own space, was an immediate, necessary triage. They started packing immediately. It wasn't about clothes or possessions, it was about curating the few items that didn't feel tainted by the manor's toxic atmosphere. I watched Clara in her old bedroom, a sanctuary she hadn't occupied since the 2014 eruption. She wasn't just tossing things into a suitcase, she was conducting an archaeological dig of her 20s. She pulled out a half-finished canvas, a portrait of a city street in deep shadow, clearly Florence. "I tried to paint over the doubt," she murmured, tracing the lines of the street with a finger. "But every brushstroke felt like a concession. I'm taking this, and I'm going to finish it, but the light has to be different. It has to be honest light." Liam, meanwhile, was clearing out his small study, an annex Arthur had granted him years ago in a patronizing gesture of support for his writing hobby. He was ruthless, ripping down the framed certificates and awards Arthur had insisted he display, proof of institutional obedience. He kept only a worn leather-bound notebook filled with cynical poetry, the raw material of his true self. "I told him I was leaving this morning," Liam said, appearing suddenly in the doorway. He just nodded. "Didn't ask where, didn't ask when I'd return. Just, take what you need." That lack of resistance was more telling than any grand, begging apology. Arthur was accepting his punishment, irrelevance. My task was the most abstract, yet the most essential for their future, untangling the finances. Arthur, the master of leverage and opaque structures, had interwoven our trusts and his business ventures like thick, thorny vines. It required going back to the source, the secure storage room in the basement where decades of corporate and personal paperwork resided. I spent the rest of Christmas Day and the following morning in that dry, cold vault. The Miller name was synonymous with complexity, a testament to Arthur's belief that transparency was weakness. I sat on the concrete floor, surrounded by heavy, musty ledgers and dated contracts, the physical manifestations of the stability he had valued more than us. I found the original trust documents establishing Clara's funds. The legal language surrounding the 2014 withdrawal was precise, clinical, and devastating. It wasn't just the money. The documents detailed a series of covert meetings, involving the aforementioned corporate attorney and several high-level associates, all conspiring to guarantee Arthur's immunity. The conspiracy wasn't a moment of panic, it was a methodical, week-long effort to sacrifice Clara's future. Reading the cold, objective truth of the betrayal made the emotional confrontation even sharper. We had felt the sting of his actions, now I saw the meticulous surgical planning behind the incision. When I finally emerged, blinking in the pale winter light of the late afternoon, I felt like I had spent days underwater. I sought out Eleanor. She was not in the drawing room, nor the kitchen. She was in Arthur's study, the nerve center of the house. But she wasn't cowering, she was rearranging it. Arthur's desk, usually pristine, was now covered with potted hyacinths and small, framed photographs of herself and Robert, photos Arthur had banned from public view after 2014. "He's upstairs," Eleanor said, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it. She was standing by the window, letting the cold air filter in. "He hasn't eaten properly. He's just waiting." "Waiting for what, Mom?" I asked. "Waiting for us to assign the penance," she replied. "But that's his mistake. Penance isn't something we assign, it's something he has to choose to live every day. I told him I'm staying here, Ethan. Not because I forgive him, but because this is my home, and I will not be driven out by his shame." Her choice to remain was an act of profound self-reclamation. She was staying to define the house on her own terms, to transform Blackwood Manor from a prison of secrecy into a stage for slow, painful recovery. "What about the finances?" I showed her the sheaf of convoluted documents related to the trusts. Eleanor examined them, her hand steady. "Untangle them, my darling. Make Clara and Liam whole. Use whatever resources necessary to make their independence absolute. This is the only way Arthur can begin to make amends, by funding the reconstruction of the lives he tried to destroy." She handed the documents back, but kept one, a small, coded memorandum detailing the transfer of funds. She took Arthur's old fountain pen, the one he used for all important signings, and neatly crossed out the clause in the memo that stated the funds were to be repaid to his corporate account over 10 years. "No," Eleanor said firmly. "This money is a severance. A down payment on their freedom. It will not be a loan tied to his ongoing control." It was a small, decisive stroke, but it was the final, total severing of Arthur's financial power over his children. Eleanor, the quiet matriarch, had delivered the coup de grace to his system of control. Later that evening, we gathered for the last time before Clara and Liam departed. We convened in the oak dining hall, the huge mahogany table now seeming even larger, emphasizing the spaces between us. The dinner felt like an event staged after the main tragedy. No forced cheer, no festive music. Just the scraping of forks and the silence of exhaustion. Arthur finally appeared. He had shaved, but his silver hair looked duller, and his imposing posture was gone. He walked with a slight stoop, accepting the judgment of the room. He took his place at the head of the table, but the chair no longer seemed like a throne, it was just a seat. Clara and Liam sat side by side, radiating a quiet, shared purpose. They spoke about their logistical plans, the train to New York City, the flight booking, the initial Airbnb in Lisbon. They discussed these practicalities with the frankness of business partners initiating a necessary venture, not siblings running away. Arthur listened, his eyes rarely lifting from his plate. He finally spoke, his voice gravelly, unused. "I have already signed the authorization for the financial restructuring," he said, addressing me, the executor. Do what is necessary, Ethan. Do what they need. He looked at Clara. Clara, I know that Europe is significant for you. I hope you find the peace I stole. Clara met his gaze, not with heat, but with a cool, steady assessment. Peace isn't something you give, Arthur. It's something I have to earn back. I will find it by doing the work, not by waiting for your permission. Her response was neither an acceptance nor a refusal of his apology. It was a statement of independence. Liam spoke next, his usual cynical edge replaced by a quiet intensity. I want nothing from this house, Dad. Except the ability to be completely separate from it. I need to know that my achievements, if they come, are mine alone, untainted by your structure. Arthur nodded slowly. Fair enough. The conversation was a series of measured, carefully placed stones, defining the new boundaries. No one asked for forgiveness, and no one offered false promises of reconciliation. It was simply the acknowledgement that the rules of engagement had irrevocably changed. After dinner, as I cleared the heavy, unused silver dishes from the oak dining hall, a task I performed almost ritually now, Eleanor came in to help. You're taking on a lot, my son, she observed, stacking plates with surprising efficiency. It's better than denial, Mom, I confessed. For years, I told myself I was the stabilizer. I maintained the peace, but that peace was built on a lie. I was an accomplice to silence. This cleanup is my attempt at genuine stabilization. You are giving them a foundation that won't crumble, Eleanor affirmed. That is a far greater service than preserving a reputation. We finished the cleanup, leaving the dining hall stark and quiet. I walked back toward the library where I had set up my temporary financial headquarters. The separation felt heavy already. I found Arthur standing by the fireplace in the library, looking at the spot where the legal documents had burned. He wasn't pacing, he was simply existing, a diminished man in an overly grand room. The greatest cruelty, Arthur whispered, catching my eye, is that I only realized I loved them more than my reputation when the reputation was entirely shattered. I wasted decades prioritizing the external view over the internal reality. You have to live with the internal reality now, Arthur, I said gently. That's the cost of admission to what's left of our family. I knew I needed to establish my new parameters with him. I won't be managing your corporate business, Dad, I stated, placing the financial documents on the desk. I will only manage the separation of our family assets. You need to hire someone external to manage the company. Someone who doesn't owe you filial loyalty. The Miller family is not the Miller Corporation anymore. That must be absolute. Arthur didn't argue. He looked tired, accepting the final isolation of his professional life from his personal life. Understand. The next morning, the snow had stopped. The sky was a sharp, unrelenting blue. The air was frigid, cutting. It was the morning of the departure. Clara and Liam stood in the large entrance hall of Blackwood Manor, suitcases at their feet. They looked ready, their exhaustion replaced by the nervous energy of pioneers. Eleanor embraced each of them, her resolve still present, but her eyes wet. Go. Be free. And write to me. Not emails. Letters. Liam actually smiled, genuinely, for the first time since he had smashed the Santa. I will, Mom. Maybe he'll even send you a postcard that isn't cynical. I drove them to the train station in the small upstate town. The drive was quiet. We passed the familiar landmarks, the rolling hills, the bare trees, all covered in pristine white. It felt like driving through a memory. At the station, the platform was nearly deserted. The smell of cold metal and distant exhaust hung in the air. Clara turned to me as the train approached, its horn sounding a long, melancholy note. Keep the light on, Ethan. And don't let him retreat back into silence. Make him speak the truth every day, if only to himself. I will, I promised. I will keep this place honest. Liam gripped my shoulder firmly. You're doing the hard work here, brother. The stationary work. Well, send you proof that radical honesty can actually build something beautiful. They boarded the train, two figures moving toward the promise of unknown light. I watched them find their seats, their faces illuminated by the dusty train window, before the massive steel body pulled away, accelerating rapidly until it was just a dark streak against the white landscape. I drove back to Blackwood Manor alone. The silence in the car was overwhelming. It wasn't the suffocating silence of secrets, but the empty, resonant silence of absence. When I re-entered the house, it felt cavernous. The festive lights, still blinking in the drawing room, now looked absurd, relics of a tradition we had successfully dismantled. I went straight to the library. Arthur was still there, sitting at the desk, sorting through old receipts, mundane, harmless paperwork. "They're gone," I announced, stating the obvious truth. "Yes," Arthur murmured. "They are free." I took the small, tarnished silver bowl containing the ashes of the destroyed legal documents, Liam's eviction notice, and carried it out to the sunken garden. The garden was even colder now, frozen solid. The neglect seemed less tragic and more symbolic of the necessary stillness before growth. I dug a shallow hole near the base of a skeletal rose bush, its thorns sharp and exposed. I knelt and gently poured the fine black ash into the earth, covering it with frost-hardened soil. This was not burial. This was grounding. I stood up, brushing the dirt and snow from my hands. I looked back at Blackwood Manor. It was still imposing, still built of cedar and stone, still smelling faintly of pine and mold, but it was fundamentally different. The foundation, though born of corruption, now supported an architecture of painful, chosen truth. We had survived the holiday. The transformative magic of Christmas had not been the effortless mending of wounds, but the brutal, necessary surgery that allowed us to identify the rot and excise it. Clara and Liam were gone, pursuing their own definitions of self-worth. Eleanor was staying, reclaiming her narrative within the existing structure. Arthur was broken, facing the long, solitary road of true atonement. And I, Ethan, the cautious peacemaker, was now the warden of honesty, maintaining the vulnerable, messy connections that bound us across the miles. We were not the united, smiling family captured in the deceitful Miller family portrait upstairs. We were separated, scarred, and still deeply flawed. But for the first time, we were choosing our bond, not inheriting it. We were not a lost family anymore. We were a family learning how to be found, acknowledging that home was not a place, but the painful, radical truth shared between imperfect people who were finally ready to love each other without conditions. The work had just begun, but the walls were down. The long Christmas journey back had finally allowed us to start building home, brick by honest brick, in the cold, clear light of the truth. If you agree tyranny must fall, like and subscribe to join our future battles.